Hi, folks. I'm going to do a short video here discussing a video put together by Testify, who is a just phenomenal YouTube apologist and does great work. I'm a huge fan. And in this video, he's rebutting some arguments from another really renowned YouTuber, Alex O'Connor, who is an atheist and skeptic. And what we know that most skeptics and atheists believe is that the Gospels are largely fictitious and sensationalized accounts of an historical figure named Jesus Christ. In fact, some of the skeptics argue, again, just perplexingly against the weight of evidence that Jesus never existed. Again, but set that aside. These skeptics who argue that the Gospels are fiction also argue that legends grew about Jesus over time and that he never claimed to be God, at least in the earliest accounts. Okay, that's fine. Here on this channel, it's our job, yours and mine, to deal with the arguments as they're presented to us. So let's just accept that position. Let's accept, purely for the sake of argument, that it's true that the earliest gospel writers were writing mythology and that they did not believe that Jesus ever claimed to be God. Now I'm going to roll the clip from Testify and then we'll discuss this further.
Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself. I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words.
In my last two videos, we've been talking about how Alex O'Connor here is just dead wrong. We've been giving multiple examples of how, over and over, Jesus calls himself God in the Synoptic Gospels. But first, I want to address a fallacy that Alex is making here. Jesus doesn't need to walk around with a neon sign saying, "I'm God," in order to make his identity obvious. This is just the exact word fallacy. Rejecting something because it's not worded exactly how you want, even when it's totally clear. Through what he says, does, and how he ties himself to the Hebrew scriptures, Jesus makes it pretty obvious he's divine if you're paying attention.
All right. So again, Eric from Testify does phenomenal work. You should go watch the whole video. I'll link it in the description. Again, he's really, really good. But here we have an argument that Jesus never claimed to be God, at least in the earliest Gospels. Fine. So the question for us, you and me, is what is the significance of that? What are the skeptics trying to say? And it's pretty clear. Their point of view is that Jesus as God was a late developing narrative that developed over time. And their evidence is the so-called lack of this claim in the earlier Gospels. Now, Testify deals with that argument separately, but I'm going to take a different tack here. If we assume that the earliest Gospel writers were writing fiction, then presumably they had a choice of what to include. So if it's true that Jesus didn't claim to be divine, didn't claim to be God in these earliest accounts, then why does every early gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, contain accounts of Jesus resurrecting from the dead? Why would the gospel writers who were writing fiction all include resurrection narratives? Even the shortened account of Mark, again, and that's another story for another time, include resurrection accounts. So then, as now, the inclusion of resurrection narratives is de facto proof that the gospel writers themselves believed Jesus was divine, that he was God. Even skeptical Professor Dr. Bart Ehrman concedes this point. And I'm going to read from his blog a quote. So he says, quote, "They had previously thought during Jesus' life that he was the one anointed by God to perform his task on earth, his future king. They now came to think he really was the one anointed by God. In fact, he had been taken by God up to heaven. And as I pointed out before, ancient people, whether Jews or Gentiles, who came to think that someone was taken to heaven, came to believe that he had been made a divine being, the Son of God or God himself," end quote. That's Professor Ehrman. You see this, folks? Even the most conservative and skeptical viewpoints concedes that the writers, at a minimum, thought Jesus was a God. Of course, to a monotheistic culture like the first century Jews of the Gospels, there's only one God. So again, that collapses into itself. And hence, we have doctrines like the Trinity, etc., that come out of this. So our purpose here isn't to debate Alex O'Connor's point. Again, we're taking his point and accepting it. And as accepting as true, we're letting testify and others carry the burden of showing the other statements that are made by Jesus in the early gospel narratives, and we're letting others sort of carry that burden of showing what those really say. Although I admit that I'm a little bit surprised that Alex falls into this trap, because he's usually more savvy, but maybe there's context that I'm missing here, and I don't want to read into it too much. Still, our question is, for scholars, what's the proper way to reconcile information like this, right? To reconcile the knowledge that the earliest gospel writers clearly thought that Jesus was divine, a God. We have two basic choices. One is flawed and illogical and breaks most rules of historical analysis, and the other employs sound, logical, and historical principles. I'll leave it to you to decide which of these options that follows is preferable. But there's option A. Either ignore the resurrection accounts outright, or acknowledge them and read the Gospels in a discordant way that renders the accounts incongruent or even nonsensical. And there's option B, which is to take the knowledge and clear implications of the resurrection account as evidence that the gospel writers believed Jesus was at least divine, and harmonize that indisputable knowledge with the earlier, admittedly more cryptic words of Jesus in a way that makes the entire account coherent. Now, you can decide.